share with us what are the positive things, negative things, and would the sharing that you have done in the security field, would it really have an impact on possible political solutions? The second question is, I was in the Council of Europe recently, and I heard a British analyst, a young woman, who said that the only winner in the Middle East today is Russia, because Russia puts its weight where its words are, have been spelled out. In other words, Russia acts while Europe and also the US to an extent just simply make wishes, but in the end they don't come in and commit what they should commit. Is this kind of assessment, in your opinion, correct or misjudged? Thank you.
Okay. On the first point about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I had the great pleasure of being the envoy for a year and a half, and I've had root canals that were better experiences than that. As I worked with Ariel Sharon and Nasser Arafat. I think I would be a fool to tell you I know how to solve the problem. But I can tell you some things that are wrong about the process. The first thing, and I will go back to the United States as mediator. The mediation process will never work the way it's structured now. To pick an envoy and say you're going to do touch and goes and fly in and out, you got 9 months, 6 months or whatever, and you're going to solve the final status issues, and you're going to get agreements and everything is going to be implemented, is foolish. It's ridiculous. This will take a long time to resolve. Resolving it from the top down is a wrong approach. We can paper the walls with all the agreements we already have signed by both sides, none of which have ever been implemented. And whoever you put together now isn't going to come up with any different recommendations that are there now. The problem I found is the devil's in the details. You need to put together working groups from each side and build it from the bottom up. Because when you look at something as a Palestinian or an Israeli at a solution, potential solution, and you see it in vague terms and principles, you have this uncertainty and fear about how this is going to really work on the ground. Colin Powell, in my time, wanted me to start with one issue and work it from the bottom up. And in addition to the overall approach that past envoys have done, we did this with security. We had Palestinian security forces, Israeli IDF, and others sitting down at the working level putting this together. In about 4 months, they came up with a plan that as we kicked it upstairs, nobody had any real disagreement with. And it was a phased plan as to what each had to accomplish. And actually, if you got through that plan, you would have at least stopped the occupation now. There would have been security, coordination, and trust that would have ended that. Because Hamas did not want this to happen, they had a series of very vicious attacks. And on the night we would have gotten the last signature, they killed all those Israeli patrons at the Seder dinner in Tel Aviv, and that blew up the whole deal we had on that part. But I think there's some things that are fairly mundane, like the status of distribution of water. There are big things like the status of Jerusalem and these other things. These are real issues. I know there's more to it, and I know there's philosophical differences, but my duty was to try to resolve the issues on the ground. I can see some of them being resolved through hard work, not putting a time limit on it, not letting anything that's going on in the ground affect the continuing process of bottom-up building. I think you've got to create these working groups for each issue and not let them quit. The second suggestion I would make is if you solve one, implement it. Don't wait for the whole thing to be resolved, but could you begin to implement things like if there was an agreement on borders, if there was an agreement on security and ending the occupation, could you incrementally implement it? The third thing I recommended was the quartet. The EU, the UN, Russians, and the United States are missing somebody, the Arab League. And I had this discussion with Arafat, because some of the things he has to agree to do not just affect Palestinians, but affect the whole, actually, Islamic world and Arab world. And it would be nice for him to have somebody involved in the mediation process that represents that larger world. Because I don't think he had the confidence to be able to do that. Because as he would say to me, you look at what happened to Sadat, Rabin, almost King Hussein, peacemakers are not blessed in that part of the world, and their legacy is not blessed. So they need to have involvement. It isn't the US that's going to settle this, the two parties are, but somebody has to be behind each of their signatures on this paper. And I made a number of other recommendations that we don't have time to go into now to at least improve the process and at least show some hope and be able to put something, action on the ground, and not just have a piece of paper. On your second question about Russia as winners, I think they're short-term winners. I think in this mess they came back in and reasserted their presence in the Middle East, certainly in Syria and maybe elsewhere. But I think it's a losing game for them because the partners they're picking eventually will lose in this part of the world. They have picked the same partners they did the Soviet Union, and I think in the long term they will be rejected. In the mess that exists now, they have an advantage, but I think it is short term, and it isn't going to be sustained. You have a Putin who's trying to reestablish the Soviet Empire in some ways. The same thing he's doing in Eastern Europe. He's testing NATO solidarity, particularly Western Europe solidarity, and American leadership in NATO and in the region. I mean, that's what he's about.
If I may, I'd like to add a couple of things. Largely I agree with Zinni on this issue, but as far as Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding. Can you hear me? There are three things that need to be mitigated first. One is distrust. The other one is this mutual sense of insecurity. And the third one is the issue of the illusion that some Israelis, as well as Palestinians, still believe that they can have it all. Well, I am suggesting here that when I speak about the process of reconciliation, that is, you can sit and negotiate. And to some extent, I agree with General Zinni that you have to have some kind of groups to be talking to one another. But the truth of the matter is, they sit, they negotiate, and the public remains in the dark completely. And it's the linkage between the various issues, the conflicting issues. They have to agree on everything, otherwise there's no agreement on any of the issues, even though they have agreed upon. So what we are saying here, to resume the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations today, without preceding that with a process of reconciliation, people to people, and I can give you 20 different things that people to people can do to begin to mitigate the problem of this distrust. So that people will feel more secure, both sides feel insecure, and then disabuse this strong Israeli constituency today sitting in the government who wants to annex the entire West Bank, or Hamas still continue to call for the Israel destruction. So what we're talking about here, I think leaders can sit and begin to talk again, but I do not believe they can reach any agreement because they cannot deliver. The people are not ready, are not prepared to accept the kind of concession, sweeping concession that is necessary. They've been told that the Palestinians have the right to go back to their original home. But that's not going to happen. The Israelis have been told Jerusalem will remain united city of the state of capital of the state of Israel for eternity. But that's not going to happen. There will be no peace unless Jerusalem becomes a capital of two states. What I'm saying that we need different kind of approach. 50 years ago, this might have been possible, but it's no longer possible today. The two leaders on both sides, with the best of intention, they will not be able to reach an agreement. And finally, I want to make a point. I just came back from the EU speaking to the Parliament on the Foreign Relations Committee about this very issue. And they have hung up about the quartet. And I've been saying there that you have a quartet representing the United Nations, Russia, the EU, and the United States, but where are the Arab representatives in that body? What you need is to revive, to reignite, to give a new life to the Arab Peace Initiative. The Arab Peace Initiative should have the overall framework for peace, where the Arabs themselves have vested interest, especially now that the Saudis, the Gulf states, see very much eye to eye with Israel because of their common enemy, which is Iran. That is where you're going to have to start. That is, you have to have a political framework under the Arab Peace Initiative. You have to have a process of reconciliation between people to people. And during this period of time, then you're going to have to be able to sit down sometime along the line and begin to discuss real issue as General Zinni just suggested, forming this kind of committee to begin to deal with the various issues, the conflicting issues involved.
If I can make just one short comment to follow up, because it reminded me of it. One of the proposals that was made out there, I believe it was Yossi Beilin and Yasser Rabo, when they had gone to Geneva and produced the Geneva Accords. They recommended that this be put out as a referendum to the Palestinian people and the Israeli people. Before they're rejected or not implemented by the government, let the people speak. And both governments on either side rejected that. So it kind of goes to the point about the people's voice might have a more powerful impact on the process.
I've been just 2 years, had a mission in Iraq, and we've gone over to Kurdistan. And the one thing I know is how little I know. And the other thing I've learned is that the one thing I can't trust is the American media. I don't care what your source is, left, right, or in the middle. So it's not often I have a general in front of me from the Marine Corps. So I'm going to ask you a question you may not be able to answer, but the one thing that I am implacably opposed to, both in conscience and compassion, is all the horrible violence and innocent people being killed in Syria and Iraq. The other thing I'm really implacably opposed to in conscience and compassion is the idea of the U.S. going in and stirring up a lot of more anti-American and jihadist fervor by using our troops, et cetera, et cetera. I would love to know, what is your opinion? What is the role of the American military over there? I think everybody has to play their part, but it is just a Faustian bargain no matter how you do it, so I'm just interested in your opinion on that.
Yeah. Well, I can give you, the mission is given to me, which means your government's mission. The first was to do everything in your power to ensure stability, which may be don't use military force too, including that. The second thing was to ensure access to the region, that the region wasn't cut off, blocked, dominated by a hegemon or somebody from outside, Russia and China. The third thing, because if you look at the geography, the major sea routes, which are the major trade routes of the world, go through the choke points from the Straits of Malacca, Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Suez Canal, to ensure those were open to free trade, for the world. And the other thing was the free flow of energy. Now, interestingly enough, that didn't affect the United States that much, because our reliance on Middle East oil and gas is low. But it does affect Western Europe, China, and elsewhere. And since we're such a globalized economy, it does impact our economy ultimately, but that was seen as a global mission. So those were the missions that we had. And there was, we also had, as I said before, to deter and contain. And that kind of goes back to what our mission was during the Cold War. No one wanted to get involved in a nuclear war with the Soviet Union or Red China, and so everything was done to ensure that we took the best measures we could. If you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that, to stand our ground, but do it in a way that wasn't provocative. So I can speak for my time, that was our purpose out there. That was our mission.
If I may add, when we were speaking about American involvement, just want to give you the example when President Obama establishes a so-called red line, which, of course, that is if Syria were to use chemical weapons, the United States would do something. That is what he said, and of course, he did nothing about it subsequently. That created the kind of impression throughout the Middle East that you cannot really rely on the United States to take the kind of measure that is needed to be taken, because we lost tremendous credibility. When I speak about involvement, let's take the Syrian situation. What would have been wrong for the United States to send a clear message to Assad and to Iran by bombing not civilian, but the runways, to stop these barrel bombs from killing indiscriminately thousands and thousands of people? What was wrong with bombing some of the Air Force hangars in order not to allow his helicopters and airplanes? That is the kind of thing that measures need to have been taken, would have prevented the slaughter of tens of thousands of people for the last 4 years. This is the kind of we're talking about. I'm the last one who would suggest for the United States to send the troops, send ground troops. Let's fight all the fights, whoever. That is not what we are saying. I think it has to be selective, it has to be purposeful. We have to know what is the strategy, and we have to have an exit strategy. That absolutely I agree with you. Without it, and just having an exit strategy, we should not be getting involved in any kind of conflict militarily.
I would just quickly add, we did more humanitarian and environmental protection missions than we did combat missions in the 10 years that I was involved in the U.S. Central Command. Peacekeeping missions, some in Africa, humanitarian missions in floods, disasters that we provided relief for, rescuing the Kurds, saved 500,000 Kurds from Saddam's slaughter. So many of the other things that we did that weren't listed in our mission task, what we were required to do, had a humanitarian impact. And some of the things in helping with environmental issues like hazardous waste material, preventing oil spills that would have contaminated the Gulf and the drinking water. So there was a major effort in other areas that weren't listed as pure military missions too.
I've got just a couple of comments. One is, I find it astonishing listening to two speakers. I agree with some of the points you made, the individual points you made, but I find it astonishing that we're talking about Palestine and Israel as if the U.S. has not been massively supporting Israel for decades, as if one is not a nuclear power and the other people are people under occupation. And the idea that we're talking about two sides in this kind of very almost disingenuous, misleading way is something I'd like to call attention to. The second point, which goes to the theme of the conference, is the idea of the premise of both the interventions, which is that the U.S. has a role to act on this part of the world and to shape it or not shape it, and what decisions we make or don't make, have all these consequences, which of course is true. But the premise is that somehow we have a role to play and that it's our role. And if the Russians and the Chinese or others do it, they're doing something wrong. But when we do it, we have a right to be there. And the third point I'd like to make is just specifically, actually just a technical question for the general. Why do you use the word incursion to describe the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 rather than invasion? Is that a technical term? I mean, maybe it's a military term, I don't know. Can you explain a little bit more why the term incursion rather than invasion?
I didn't understand it.
The word you used was incursion. And I'm wondering.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, if it makes you happy, it was an invasion.
I'm asking why incursion.
I mean, okay, incursion, intervention, incursion, invasion.
Well, there's a huge difference, as you know, in language between incursion and invasion. These are two different things.
Okay, all right.
And it goes to the heart of, again, misleading.
Fine, I was opposed to it. You want invasion? I love invasion. Good.
Just go back to the question of the United States influence or relationship with the state of Israel. There's no doubt that the United States has and continues to support Israel from day one. I was one of the voices who have been criticizing the United States for enabling Israel to do what it's doing, specifically in the area of building settlements. I do believe that the United States could have put its foot down and insist that the building settlement, expansion of existing one, is not acceptable because it runs totally and completely against the concept of a two-state solution. That should have been the role of the United States. The United States has enough leverage, and I repeat, enough leverage, notwithstanding what you hear and read in the news, on Israel to be able to have been able to put that kind of pressure to stop the expansion and building of new settlement. That is something that to this day is probably one of the most critical issues as far as the Palestinians are concerned. They see their land being consumed day in and day out, and they no longer see any prospect of building a viable, contiguous Palestinian state.
If I could just return quickly to Dr. Makdisi's question about asymmetry. I thought that was a really interesting one. Both of our speakers have talked about the role of external powers and the available tools in the region, and the need to recognize what the people of the region themselves want as outcomes. But I think one question is, the people of the region themselves don't all want the same things, and they themselves are asymmetrical in their power. So how should, say, the United States as an actor recognize and address that asymmetry and still try to pursue what people want in the region itself?
Well, let's take the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. I think one of the purposes of the quartet was to get some of that balance. If you look at, as I said, I recommend the Arab League be part of that, which would give more clout to the Palestinian side. The UN is seen, certainly by the Israelis, as being pro-Palestinian. You could argue that either way, but that's seen. And so the United States presence, I never understood why the Russians are there, but you know, they don't interfere in any way, at least wasn't my experience. So in many ways, just like we did the 6+1 talks with Iran, in many ways you can bring others in that give more support to a given side. You know, after I retired, I did a lot of other peace mediation work, and other times I did peace mediation work between rebel groups and governments. When you bring a rebel group to the table, they are nowhere near able to negotiate like a government with seasoned diplomats, and we would bring in professional negotiators. Some well-known, like William Ury or Getting Past Snow, to help bolster their capability to feel comfortable at the table and negotiate on the same plane or level playing field. So sometimes it could be that technical aspect, or it could be greater in that they have confidence that somebody's behind them. Another aspect of this is asymmetry and symmetry. Let's say that an agreement is reached where it's going to require some investment from the outside to make it happen. So you might find donors willing to support one side and provide that investment in order to make the agreement work. So that's another way you can weight, in the case of asymmetry, a side that isn't as robust as the other side.
My name is Urban Peachy. I worked with non-governmental organizations in the Middle East for 15 years, some decades ago. And I'm reminded that 1917, we can well say, the year of the Balfour Declaration, that it will be now the end of a 100-year war. The speakers today have pretty well established that the political process, for example, in Iraq-Afghanistan wars, destabilized and destroyed major strips of the region. The number of deaths and the side effects of the U.S. engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan probably exceed anything that has happened so far in this present time frame in Syria and Iraq. The second thing that's been pretty well established is that militarized government policies are not going to address the crisis of this season. So what are we as a community of character in this prestigious university, related to other universities like Georgetown University and Notre Dame University, just to stay within the Catholic community? What are we as a community of character? What is our imagination in a time when the political structures of which we are a part offer us little promise? The next conference should be not just to enumerate the sufferings of the people. We have to learn some things in the line of advocacy, of lobbying, and of creation of a massive voice, as we did during and after the Vietnam War. So I pose this question for the next 100 years. And I mean no profanity. I mean to ask, what, for God's sake, are we going to do the next 100 years? I doubt whether we can turn this around in my lifetime, and I'm in pretty good health, and I'm still buying green bananas.
My name is Joe Betts. I'm retired from the philosophy department here at Villanova. When I saw that this was about Christians in the contemporary Middle East, I thought about Chaldean Catholics in Iraq and their bad situation. But one of the previous speakers spoke about the fact that Christians who are now victims were once victimizers, and of course I thought about the Crusades, when we Christians were the evildoers. But then I remembered in more current times the Sabra Shatila massacre. What had happened, of course, is that Israel invaded Lebanon. Israel was very powerful. It surrounded a Palestinian refugee camp not too far from Beirut. And as Ariel Sharon kept anyone from leaving, circumscribing it with his troops, keeping any of the Palestinians from leaving, a Christian Lebanese militia went in and slaughtered everybody. And I assume they were slaughtering Muslims. Now, is that a reason why Muslims would hate Christians in the Middle East? Are they blaming all Christians for what that one militia did? What has happened as a consequence of that slaughter by Christians?
There's no question that what happened in Sabra Shatila in Lebanon is a crime. It's against humanity. And even though it might have been instigated, in fact, probably it was instigated by Ariel Sharon then, and the Christians have got involved in that horrible massacre. I think this is one of many incidents. But if you're talking in terms of relationship between today Arabs and Christians, you have to talk in terms of what's happening today. What's happening today is radicalization of Arab youth. This is very important to keep in mind. Today, the Arab youth are there's this wave of radicalization. There's the young men and women, specifically young, who feel deprived, who have very little. They are poor. There is no opportunity. They have no future. And for them, joining ISIS, joining Al-Qaeda is a way by which to identify with something because they have nothing else to identify with. This is very important to keep in mind. As such, any other minority, any other group, they see them as a competitor. They compete with them for the resources, for the limited resources they have, for the limited opportunity for better education, limited opportunity for job. This is what you see unfolding today, and that is why I'm concerned. This is not a question that's going to be rectified overnight. We have to deal with radicalization, how to de-radicalize young men and women, specifically Arabs. This is central, in my view, to start to begin a process of ending the persecution of all minorities. And I think we are not approaching this correctly because we are doing very little. Just think, 200 million Arabs young, under the age of 25, 200 million Arabs are under the poverty line. And just as many youth under the age of 25 are despondent and despairing and have very little opportunities today. This is a malaise. This has to be dealt with. And what we are applying, basically, an aspirin to a very serious disease. And that is, for example, just give you one example. Instead of providing funding for, providing Egypt, say, $2 billion a year, much of it is going to the military, I would like to see the United States insisting that 100 million of this money being given to Egypt is devoted totally and completely to sustainable development projects. So that you are empower the people from the bottom up. You give them an opportunity to have a job, to grow something of their own. This is what we see happen in various areas. So this is one program, one way by which you begin slowly to eliminate poverty. Albeit it will still take decades, but focus on sustainable development throughout the Arab world is absolutely sine qua non to begin to elevate poverty and to give the young men and women an opportunity to be able to empower themselves. And as a mind you, this has many other positive ramifications, because when you get these communities to get together, decide on their own projects, they own it. The young, these families, no longer think in terms of joining ISIS, joining Al-Qaeda, but are busy building their own community, building their own project. This is what needs to be done on a much larger scale. That's why I said the United States, any country that's providing assistance to any of the Arab states, we should be insisting that at least 10–15% of that goes to this type of project, and not through the government, but through NGOs and other civilian communities, so they can actually be devoting. And this is what needs to be done, but we are not doing that. We are not insisting upon.
I'm Susan Underwood, and my question is for Dr. Ben-Meir. I wanted to follow up. You mentioned education as one of the ways that could help end persecution, and you're talking about sustainability. So could you talk about what the state of education is right now? I'm sure it's from almost non-existent to, I'd like to know what's going on and what your vision is. Thank you.
Education in this time, this era, this time, that is, if we want to look at the next generation, how do you begin a process where Israelis and Palestinians can see eye to eye, where a Palestinian Arab can see eye to eye with a Christian Arab? What it is that is missing? If you go to the schools, to any school you wish to see, you will see that children are not being taught tolerance, are not being taught other religion, are not being taught to have respect for someone who has a different opinion. I mean, I went to the West Bank, to Palestine, and I went to this school, and I see some of these books, and I tell you some of it is terrible, because what the young Palestinian is learning, that the Jew is someone who has a rival who's going to kill you. Or you go to the Israeli side, and you see these young boys, 10, 12 years old, who will see a Palestinian as the eternal enemy. That is the school, not only the school, that is parents, school system, all of it are perpetuating that kind of hatred. They're building walls between these two societies that are doomed to coexist, whether they like it or not. And that is, to me, the most painful thing. Israelis and Palestinians, in this particular case, must coexist because they don't have a choice. They're stuck. The question is, are they going to want to live in peace at one point or another, or continue to kill each other for the next 100 years? So education matters a great deal. What you impart to the next generation. Instead, the Israelis are victimizing 4 generations. The Palestinians have been doing the same thing. You talk to a boy, 10 years old Palestinian, he'll talk about the Nakba, the catastrophe of 48, as if he or she experienced it. And you talk to an Israeli boy or girl at that age, and he will speak about the Holocaust as if themselves experienced it. But there is no balance in the education. There is no understanding that the two sides exist side by side. They must begin. If they want to live in peace, they're going to have to start with this generation. They have to start now. In order, at one point or another, sometime in the next 15 years, or else we would be sitting, if we were to live 100 more years, we'd be still talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the plight of the Christians and the Yazidis and the Arabs and the Sunnis throughout the Middle East and beyond that. Something needs to be changed. And these are within reach. When it comes to education, it is within reach, and we have to be serious about it.
General, you emphasize the importance of implementation, but major aspects of the peace process in regards to Palestine and Israel are not being implemented, and the U.S. is not holding Israel accountable for it. An example would be the transferring of power of Area C back to the Palestinians, that it was in the Oslo Accords, that never happened. So how can we have trust in the peace process or in the mediation of the United States if Palestinians are the ones that lose over and over after these peace process?
Sure.
in terms of implementation, and I can speak to the security plan that we worked on, because how we monitored implementation and judged success on implementation, there were objectives or goals for both sides. And you could not move to the next phase, which had importance for both parties, unless you completed your objectives and goals. And the objectives were very quantitatively measured. They weren't subjective. We did put in a caveat, actually at the Palestinian request, that in some cases, if you didn't reach an objective or a goal, if there was sincere effort in it, that a judgment could be made. Now, to your question about who makes that judgment, it was the mediation, the quartet and the United States, the UN, we would weigh in on that. Obviously, both sides have to accept it, but one of the things that we wanted to do is make it as objective as possible, quantitative as we could. It was things like the number of checkpoints that are reduced and moved, the things like that you could actually physically see on the ground that allowed you to move to greater stages. The issue of monitoring and adjudication of issues is an important one on these plans. And so if you were to do these things, let's take one that's relatively easy to deal with, like water distribution. How the water will be distributed, fair share, how it will be judged. Part of the plan has to be a monitoring and adjudication element in it to say it's done in accordance with the plan. Now, where should that come from? Again, I go back to, I think you could call on a mix from the Arab League, from the quartet. If you had Arab League, if you made it a quintet, it could be the United States, it could be the United Nations, it could be the EU, it could be several representatives that form a committee to make sure they validate those procedures. We never got that far, I have to tell you that, but that was the thinking we were looking at once we got the plan signed.
One other major mistake I think took place over the last two sets of negotiations, mediating Marjan, Secretary of State Kerry, was the way the rules of engagement were established. This is very important to keep in mind. When you do not start with such rules whereby you can progress from one point to the next, where you're bound to fail. For example, Israel insisted to start with concern over national security. Well, if you want to talk about two-state solution, ideally you want to start with borders. Now, if you were to start with borders, you could conceivably move, because since Israel connected borders to national security, once you talk about borders, you can begin to actually address the question of national security as a part of it, or the question of the settlement. If you start with borders, you can also begin to define which settlement is going to be part of Israel or other part of the settlement might have to be removed. So we've been studying this. I've been studying this very carefully, and I can tell you, every time when we looked at the rules of engagement, whether it's formed by committees or direct negotiation, there were something that was wrong, and we knew in advance it wasn't going to work, because Israel wanted to start to negotiate on issues that wanted to matter to Israel. For the Palestinians was to start with borders, and they could never really agree to negotiate on the issue that could advance the peace process from one point to the next.
Let's say one thing, because you reminded me of it. I forgot to mention that in my time there in the mediation, we brought the head of the Christian denominations in the Palestinian territories, we got them involved in the process. To my surprise, beyond the 3 or 4 that actually have physical responsibility on the ground, there were 16 Christian denominations represented in the Holy Land. And I met with them several times, and they asked to meet with the Secretary of State, Secretary Powell, and their message was, don't forget us in this process. We seem to be a sideshow, and they wanted direct involvement. And our consulate, the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, brought them into the process, and we made sure we briefed them on where we were, what we were doing. So it was an important step. We never really got to exactly how we would engage them at that point, you know, because of the process being broken down. But the Christians were adamant of the leadership about not being outside this process or being included overall in the Palestinian, but having an additional voice in this.
I think we have time for one more question, unfortunately.
Yes, I have
Question,
one.
please.
I'm sorry.
Right. I'd like to speak to 2 points. One is to the question of radicalization of Arab youth. And I would beg to differ in the sense that the most important radicalization to confront now is in the much higher echelons of political government in the region, starting with the Israelis. I cannot expect, and I agree that education would be a great solution to bring communities together, to understand each other, to learn who the other are, but I cannot expect the current right-wing government of Israel to actually institute such an educational program. I cannot expect that, you know, the leadership of ISIS or of Iran or of the current regime in Syria is going to actually take steps to move forward on understanding and openness and that direction. So therefore, it has to be policies at that level. And that's where the role of the US comes in, where, you know, the expectation, and I appreciated your comments about, you know, let's not send the military in every time somebody sneezes, but to say that the US, in fact, has very little credibility as a peacemaker in the region. You know, this is the understanding, this is the perception in the region across. From CIA engineered coups in Iran and Iraq, and historically, to the failed peace process, to refusing to allow any other process besides the process that Israel has dictated in terms of direct negotiations is the only way that will solve it. No, I say throw it into the lap of the United Nations, into the Security Council, into the General Assembly. Let there be an international peace process, because you cannot rely on a negotiated agreement between unequal parties where the candidates for presidency of the peace broker are tripping all over each other in support for Israel to say this is an honest peacemaker. It's not going to work. It doesn't work. It has to bring back, and this is where I come back to what I was saying earlier, is that you go back to the principles of international law, the principles of human rights, and you say this is the basis for discussion, and the only forum you can do that is in the United Nations.
You know, with all due respect, you know, we're still talking about some editorial reviews. If you have that much faith in the United Nations, I applaud you. I don't. I'd like you to remind me of one case where the United Nations, be that Security Council or General Assembly, that have taken it without any meaning whatsoever, and it's specifically when it comes to conflict. You know, maybe perhaps in Bosnia and other places, but the truth of the matter, when it came to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the United Nations has been sitting on its hand. The Security Council has been unable to act. Yes, you might say the United States has always been supportive and vetoed any kind of resolution that was against Israel, but that's exactly the point. The international system, the way you're describing it, is not working and not going to work. Because in the end, when you have a Security Council, 15 members sitting there, they disagree on so many issues. In the end, if they agree on anything, they agree on the lowest denominator. And the lowest denominator doesn't get us hardly anywhere sometimes. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a conflict between two people. You need a mediator, like the United States, that has influence on both sides. In fact, the United States is the only country that has that kind of influence, along, of course, with some Arab states. You may disagree with me. I have been personally very much involved directly and indirectly in this kind of process. And I can tell you that the United States, in many ways, has not been able to bridge the gap because there is significant misunderstanding on the part of the United States about what does it really take in order to get the people to change mindset. I know we keep talking about conflicting issues. We keep forgetting that every conflicting issue is impacted upon by certain psychological dimension. Look, you cannot mitigate the borders or the national security for the state of Israel because they are haunted still by the Holocaust. You cannot mitigate the problem of refugees returning because the Palestinians still, to this day, continue to push for the Nakba and the Palestinian right of return. What I'm saying is all of these issues are connected to history. For example, you have mutual religious claim to the same territory, to Jerusalem. This is the problem. You have every conflicting issue is impacted upon by religious precepts, history, ideology, and if you don't mitigate that, you are not going to be able to solve the question of future of Jerusalem, or the right of the Palestinian to return, or Israel national security. This is what we're talking about. And that is why the United States been going around and around. Yes, with all of its support to the state of Israel, what is the result today? I think in the long term, Israel today is probably in much worse shape than otherwise it would be, because Israel is stuck. And every day that passes, Israel is creating irreversible facts on the ground. And one day or another, they're going to be faced with this basic reality, simple reality. What is going to happen? Will the Palestinians continue to accept occupation indefinitely? There's only a question of time where you're going to see a massive explosion. And that is the problem, because we haven't been able to tackle this conflict in a manner so that understand the mindset of the people, where they come from, how to mitigate these issues that have long history, be that religious ideology or history.
There's a difference between arbitration, mediation, and facilitation. What you suggest is arbitration, that the mediator, using the broader term, actually makes decisions or forces sides to do something. I want to make the point about what you're looking for in this intermediary. A facilitator basically says, you two have to decide, I'll set up the process, I'll do the logistics, get you together. Mediator gets more involved, makes suggestions, recommendations, nothing like an arbitrator that stand. Now, the role of the United States, everybody I talked to in the Palestinian Authority told me it has to be the United States, because that's how we hold Israel's feet to the fire. So that was an unusual recommendation to go to the UN. The Israelis will never agree to it, so how would you get there? That's wonderful in theory. And the other alternative is an NGO, a mediation NGO. You pick one, or a neutral country. The Norwegians or the Swedes or somebody comes in. But that's never worked either. They've attempted to go off on their own, right? Did not work. They attempted it at Madrid. They attempted it at Oslo. There have been people that tried to broker it directly. Some of the quartet members tried to do it on their own. Didn't work. I'm sure the United States, I can't speak for the United States government, would be happy to pass it to somebody else. And who would like that poison apple? You tell me.